Hello and welcome. If you haven't already, I invite you to please click subscribe. There's no obligation, and it allows you to be notified of all new chapters. Additional information about the story, including the author, chapter warnings, and rating, can be found in the description below. All credit goes to the original author. All That Remains by Orphan Account. Chapter 14. Meeting Hope. Third Age, 2956, 55 years ago. Legolas ran. He ran as if Sauron himself were chasing him, leaping and bounding through the trees with a speed so great his vision blurred. The reason for his haste? What had started off as a vague tip-off hinting at danger had turned into a race against time. Legolas carried news that, if ignored or delivered too late, meant death for a person whose demise would shift the balance of the war in Sauron's favor. What was the information the elf carried? The Witch King was sending an assassin after Elven King Thranduil. Legolas did not know why the Nazgûl Lord had decided to kill the Sinda now. Everyone knew that Mirkwood would suffer if Thranduil died, even with his eldest son, Aglar, prepared to take the throne. The death of their king would be a terrible blow against the elves that greatly held back the shadow, which was why Legolas was going to make sure the assassin the Witch King sent would not succeed. The elven assassin's feet pounded against his perches as he pushed himself to go faster. He had no idea when the evil assassin was going to strike. He had to warn the elves. Legolas knew that ever since his escape, Sauron had decided hiring assassins was less costly than risking another renegade. All of Sauron's hired professional killers were men, mostly from the east. They were highly dangerous and well-trained, able to hide in the shadows as easily as the elf. However, they did not have Legolas's experience and heightened senses. The elf could only hope it would be enough so that he could sense and stop the other assassin before he could kill his target. If not, staying hidden would no longer matter. There was no way that Legolas was going to let the Elven King die. The sounds of the horses' hooves were muffled on the dirt and stone road that the 8 stallions trod on. Their riders were all from Rivendell, intent on reaching the palace of the Elven King before nightfall. The party included Elrond, his twin sons, Aragorn, more commonly known as Estel, Glorfindel, Erestor, and 3 warriors of Imladris. The purpose of their visit was mostly at the request of the Elven King, partly social and partly because such a visit was far overdue. Recently, Elrond had created a new antidote to spider venom, using herbs commonly found in Mirkwood. The instructions and preparation of the medicine was complicated and specific. A single mix-up or mistake making a poison instead of a healing potion. As such, Elrond and Thranduil had agreed it would be better to have the Elf Lord travel to Mirkwood and teach the healers there the antidote himself, in order to avoid harm and potential fatalities. Elrond's sons were traveling with him for safety and because the twins wanted to see their Mirkwood royal family friends and introduce them to their adopted brother. At 25 years of age, Aragorn was a grown man by human standards, but still quite young to both men and elves. He had found out about his heritage 7 years ago, at the age of 18. He had gone out to join the Rangers and explore Middle-earth right after, just recently returning to his family. The man still felt guilty whenever he remembered how Elrond had greeted him when he had finally returned. The Elf Lord had hugged him tightly, as if he were afraid his son would fade away if he let go. Aragorn knew his departure had been abrupt after he had learned the truth, but he did not know it had affected his family so badly. He had been angry and upset at them all, understanding why Elrond had kept such information from him, but still bitter over the truth about his ancestry. Now a terrible destiny hovered over him, like a lingering doom in the back of his mind that refused to leave. The man would rather be in self-imposed exile than claim the throne of Gondor to himself. He was Strider, the ranger, and Estel, son of Elrond, not Aragorn, heir of Isildur and Elisar, future king of Gondor. But it was not only the thought of one day becoming king that burdened the man, but also thoughts and worries about Sauron and the growing shadow. The Dark Lord was looking for him. Well, not him specifically, not yet anyway. Sauron and his Nazgûl were ever searching for signs that the line of kings continued. They had had no luck finding proof of the vague rumors that the elves of Rivendell or Lothlorien had raised and hid the next king. Still, even the least detailed rumors were enough to draw the Shadow's attention, so Aragorn was forced to be careful, only sharing his real name and heritage with very few people. One could never be certain who overheard. Glorfindel was also traveling with his lord in case of trouble on the road, while Erestor went with them with the intent of making copies of the antidote recipe for the healer's use once in the palace. Finally, Amalug and 2 other warriors named Rainier and Euelos were accompanying the party, serving as a partial warrior guard along with their charges. It was true that each member of the party could take care of and fight for themselves, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Rainier and Euelos were likable and cheerful enough, talking with the twins and Aragorn while scanning the area, but Amalug was his usual dark self. The vengeful warrior distanced himself from the others, keeping to the edge of the group and not taking part in any discussions within. He did his job, but obviously was not pleased with it, though the prospect of entering the orc and spider-infested Mirkwood cheered him up slightly. Personally, Aragorn could not understand why Glorfindel had let the elf come on this mission. Tension between the warrior and Elrond had been rising steadily ever since the Elf Lord had adopted Aragorn. Amalug did not like the human, or any race other than elves, and made it obvious when Elrond, Glorfindel, and Erestor were not around anyway. He did not believe a human should live in Rivendell, and should especially not be adopted by the Hidden Valley's leader. Even now, Amalug was sending sharp glares in Aragorn's direction whenever the Elf Lords were not looking. But that antagonism and distance was only a small crack compared to the rift that had formed between Amalug's group and the rest of Rivendell and Lothlorien. Over the past few decades, the warrior and his followers had traveled further and further away from Imladris to hunt orcs, their hatred of the Shadow rising more each passing day. Aragorn understood and respected the warriors for that, but their methods were questionable at times. He had been present 10 years ago, when Amalug had been severely reprimanded for almost burning down a human town during his latest excursion. The warrior was careful to toe the line, but never cross it, making sure not to give Elrond a reason to carry out his threats of exiling him and his followers from all elven realms. The whole debacle disturbed and worried the House of Elrond. Amalug and his warriors were still soldiers of Rivendell and Lothlorien, yet at the same time, they were almost not. While some returned home and reverted back into peaceful, fun, calm elves, others impatiently waited for the next hunt, a wild energy surrounding their every action and thought. It was unnatural for elves to wish to use the violence and anger that Amalug's group sometimes favored. This brought out a new fear that Elrond and his kin had never considered before. Somehow, in some way, the darkness was affecting them. After long years of distant notation on the behavioral changes in the angry elves, patterns and behavioral shifts were revealed. They were quick to anger, colder, snappish, and more apathetic. They distanced themselves from other elves except those with the same quirks. They were less prone to laugh and never sang, going about their day with stoic grimness. In Rivendell and Lothlorien, such behavior was plainly unprovoked and disturbing to see in so many ways. There was no need for the elves to act like that in the light ring-protected realms. The shadow could not touch them there. Apparently, though, it could. Only one linking element could be found between the elves with this strange personality shift. All of the elves had lost someone to the shadow. Wives, husbands, children, parents, or friends. It appeared that the void created by the loss and the grief that would tarnish their soul until they went west had been filled with hatred and anger. However, this odd personality change did not affect all elves, which brought an even worse truth to light. Whatever was happening, whatever was making these elves vengeful and angry, could most likely only infect them if they let it. No one knew how it had happened, or what to do. It was not as if they had any solid proof, only the terrible instinct and sense that certain powerful elves possessed. It was not as if they could call the elves back to the light, like one could with a wound. This malady was like grief, almost like grief had been replaced by thoughts of vengeance and could not be magicked away. Amalug and his warriors would only heal and fight the shadow inside themselves if they wanted to. But they did not want to, and that was the problem. Elrond and Galadriel had kept in contact about their shadowed elves, and agreed there was nothing they could do now but wait. They could not order the elves west to heal, and outright telling the warriors about the problem would only make it worse. Aragorn knew how such a revelation would be taken. Amalug would claim that Elrond was prejudiced against him, and would take his warriors and run. That would not help the Elf Lord and Lady of Light in their plan to keep an eye on these warriors. They could only hope that once the darkness was defeated, the shadows on the elves' souls would fade. That time could not seem to happen fast enough, especially whenever Aragorn was with Amalug. The elf's attitude towards him varied from cold disdain to hostile action. The man had learned long ago to ignore the elf's hateful and hurtful words, and luckily physical attack was not a problem. Amalug's dark glares and cold sneers could be ignored, but they were utterly disturbing to the man. Sometimes, Aragorn swore that when Amalug looked at him with hate-filled eyes, something other than an elf was glaring at him, ready to rip him apart. Still, Amalug never attacked him, no matter how much the elf looked like he wanted to at times, and insults technically were not a crime, so Aragorn did not speak of his unease to anyone. He had been ignoring Amalug for years, and would continue to ignore him as long as he needed to. Besides, he was an adult now, and there was no need for him to go running to his father or brothers like a child who was having trouble with a bully. Estelle? The man turned to look at Elrohir, who was watching him with a concerned expression on his face. Your mind was far away, the younger twin said, once his brother's attention was on him. What are you thinking so intently about? Is something bothering you? Aragorn shrugged and avoided his eyes, looking up into the treetops. Nothing is bothering me. Elrohir frowned, but did not press him. Is there anything I should know before we get to the palace? Aragorn asked his brothers, intent on drawing the subject away from his troubled thoughts. I don't want to be thrown into the dungeons because I unintentionally insulted someone. The twins thought about what he said. Don't speak lightly of the shadow, orcs, or spiders, Elladan said first. Ever. These elves have lost a lot more to them than we have. Don't go out into the forest without a guide, Elrohir added suddenly. I know you like to be alone, to think, but don't run off. You make me sound like a child, Aragorn grumbled. Not a child, Elladan said. Just a man who can be quite reckless. I'm reckless, Aragorn spluttered indignantly. You... Don't try to watch any warriors training without telling them before they start, Elrohir interrupted. The Mirkwood warriors can be as taut as bowstrings. No pun intended. So pretty much I have to be careful or I'm going to get myself killed, Aragorn asked dryly. The twins nodded. Yes, Elrohir said. Even with the Mystery Guardian killing off a bunch of orcs and spiders, and Dol Guldur's loss in power after the White Council invaded it, Mirkwood is dangerous, and its people are even more so. A joke at home can be a deep insult here, and I'm not sure how welcome you will be. Aragorn frowned, instantly understanding his meaning. He knew that the royal family was slightly prejudiced against men. Thranduil and Aglar would be courteous out of diplomacy if they did not like him, but the ranger was not sure about the other princes and princesses. Fael will accept you, no doubts about it, Elladan said encouragingly. Barhad as well. But Baroneth, well, if she doesn't, she'll let you know. Hanel's in Lothlorien, so you don't need to worry about her. I don't know how Megalog will be, but that's just the worst-case scenario. Who knows? They might all be friendly towards you. I hope so, Aragorn thought. Otherwise, this trip will be a very unhappy one. That reminds me, Elrohir said, and his voice was low and sober. Don't mention the lost prince. A solemn air came over the party at his words. Aragorn vaguely remembered the twins talking about the lost elf prince when he was a child. The mix of grief and rage on their faces had always confused his younger self. It was only later that Aragorn was told the story of Celebrian and how she had been captured by orcs. The news that young Legolas had been taken by the vile creatures still hurt and angered the twins for that reason, even centuries after the event. And if it was still a touchy subject for them, it would only be more taboo with the royal family. The man shook his head, thoughts filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and grief. It pained him deeply that the orcs had taken, tortured, and killed a mere child. Then again, they were evil to their core, and morals did not exist within them. The lost prince was just another reminder of how cruel the darkness could be. I'll remember that, Aragorn said grimly. They rode on in silence for another half-hour, moving at a steady pace. The road curved as they traveled along, a deep ravine carved into the earth on their right side. Elladan glanced down the deep chasm at the roiling waters below, whistling softly. I always forget how deep this is, the older twin said. Be careful not to fall in, Estelle. The man scowled at his brother. I fell in the river once, when I was 5. And you fell off a tree when you were 7, Elrohir commented. And out of a second-story window when you were 10, Elladan added. There was also that time you fell off of a horse and into a pond when you were 15, Glorfindel joined in. You do tend to fall off of, out of, and into things, Estelle, Aristor said dryly. The man did not endow him with a reply. Are we almost there? He asked Elrond. The elf lord shook his head. No, though we should run into a patrol soon. Stop, Elrohir said suddenly, stopping his horse. The others halted as well, all looking at the younger twin. Beneath them, their mounts fidgeted nervously, ears flicking back and forth. Elrohir was silent for a long moment, eyes closed. Aragorn recognized his brother's stance as the one he took while concentrating on sensing something. Almost immediately, the Paradell's eyes snapped open, and his head jerked back, looking upward. Above! Aragorn followed his gaze, and caught a glimpse of odd reflections in the trees. Then, spiders were dropping down on them. The man was forced to leap from his horse as a spider attempted to land directly on him. His stallion was unable to dodge the falling monster, and it landed on his back, forcing the horse to the ground. Aragorn stabbed the spider in the eye before it could kill his mount. The horse gave a neigh, almost like a thank you, and stood. The stallion gave the creature a firm kick, sending it flying into a few of its kin. Nearby, most of the other travelers were still on their horses, but Elrond and Iuilo's mounts were dead. The Elf Lord and Rivendell warrior were unharmed, back to back, with swords drawn. With the two elves on foot, fleeing the spiders would be impossible in these unfriendly woods. The spiders creached at and circled the elves and man, closing in on them. The strongest spiders' bodies are protected by an exoskeleton, so stab hard, Glorfindel said quickly, eyes never leaving the incoming monsters. The eyes, neck, head, belly, and legs are the weakest points. Be careful with the legs, though. Some of them have limbs that are sharp like spears. The lone man of the group acknowledged the Balrog Slayer's statement by slicing off a spider's head. He could hear the others fighting the spiders around him, their shouts and war cries not distracting him from his own battle. A spider loomed over him, snapping at the ranger with its pincers. Aragorn lodged his blade between the sharp appendages, unsheathing his dagger and stabbing the creature in the eye. It screamed and pulled away, freeing both his blades. The metal was now covered in the black blood of dark creatures. Ignoring the gore, the man sheathed his knife, holding his sword in both hands. He jumped backwards, out of the path of a leaping spider, stabbing it in the back. A horizontal swing severed 3 legs off another spider. It fell sideways, shrieking and hissing. A quick thrust silenced it. A sticky white substance shot through the air from above him, hitting Aragorn's left leg and arm. The man gave a yell as the spider that created the web pulled on it, dragging the ranger upwards. Aragorn slashed through the web with his sword, falling to the ground. The landing jostled him, but did not hurt. He rolled to the side, but the spider expected the move, landing on top of him and pinning his sword and right arm to the ground. He found himself inches from sharp black pincers. The man quickly unsheathed his dagger, only slightly hindered by the web loosely wrapped around his limb, and stabbed it into the spider's gut. It screamed and fell next to him. Aragorn rolled away from the corpse, rising to his feet. The ranger brushed as much of the web off as he could, renewing his full mobility. He cut off a foreleg of another spider, its hissing grating on his ears. The ranger stabbed it directly between its pincers, jerking the blade free harshly. Spotting 8 of the odd reflections in the trees again, Aragorn notched an arrow to his bow, firing the arrow. The projectile hit the spider directly in its glassy eye, the corpse falling to the ground. Looking at the grotesque body, Aragorn allowed himself a single moment to shudder. Normal spiders he had no fear of. These ones? Just a little. They were more than scary looking. He stabbed another spider in its large round body, sword easily stabbing through the exoskeleton, despite Glorfindel's warning. So these were not even the largest and most dangerous spiders in Mirkwood. The thought was not comforting. The familiar hissing and clicking came from his right. Aragorn turned, eyes narrowing as they looked into the large black orbs of a spider. This one did not rush him, pausing and screeching as it studied him. It seemed to be considering its next move. The man observed the monster just as intently. The standoff lasted only a few seconds before the spider burst into motion, springing at the man. Aragorn stepped back out of its path and found himself wobbling precariously as his foot landed on the edge of the cliff behind him, almost sending him toppling into the ravine. In the heat of battle, he had forgotten about the ravine, a rookie mistake the man could already see Glorfindel scolding him for. Seeing its opponent's plight, the spider lunged again, stabbing at him with its forelegs. The man blocked a blow, wavering, and another strike sent his sword flying from his hand. The force of the blow was enough to finish the job, his equilibrium failing completely as the shove unbalanced him fully. Unable to right himself, Aragorn fell backwards, plummeting over the edge of the cliff. He thought he heard one of the twins scream his name, but could not be sure over the sound of the air as it rushed past him. The man tumbled and spun as he fell towards the river, his uncontrolled freefall soon to be halted by the rushing water. The brown-gray cliff he fell beside rushed by at incredible speeds, seeming to move while he stayed still. The impact was going to hurt, a lot. But oddly enough, though his body was tense with panic, his thoughts were calm. He was shocked, surprised, and bewildered, but unafraid as he fell. Perhaps I do fall off of things too much, the man thought blankly, unable to fully register what was happening. His head struck the side of the rocky ravine, and everything went black. Legolas was still running through the treetops when the shadowed tree's sudden, hissing laughs made him lose his footing. The assassin fell 3 feet before he grabbed a branch, swinging up and landing on a sturdy limb. He glanced around at the trees, confused by their glee. Very few things could make shadowed trees excited like this. Usually, their cheer meant something was having its life threatened. Even with Dalos' influence, the shadowed trees were still prone to sadistic streaks. "What has made you all so pleased?" he asked them cautiously. The trees rustled and shook, still laughing their strange, distorted laughs. "2 bright, glowing elves and a man ran into spiders upriver," they said happily. The assassin stiffened, heart pounding in his chest. "What? Are any dead?" he asked, hiding his alarm. "No," the shadowed trees answered, irritated once more. "The 2 bright elves are riding away now alongside the river. Look at how fast they flee." Sometimes, dealing with the shadowed trees was plainly unnerving. Usually, the trees remained relatively peaceful around Dalos, only one thing able to make them the cruel, dark things that many saw them as. That thing was elves. The shadowed trees could not stand the 2 bright elves, and even Dalos had trouble keeping them from harming his kin at times. If he asked them to leave the elves alone, they would, but that would not stop them from letting spiders and orcs attack the elves. Because, although the shadowed trees hated orcs and spiders, they were the enemies of Dalos. They despised the 2 bright elves. The shadow-born instinct to destroy the light creatures was too great for them to want to assist the Eldar. But at least Legolas had gotten them to not try to kill the elves, for the most part. Otherwise, the elves would barely be able to leave their cities and villages without being struck down by the shadowed trees. "Are any of them injured?" Legolas asked the trees, keeping his voice from sounding concerned. No elves are harmed. The man fell into the ravine," the shadowed tree said dismissively. They did not care about men. Men had no too bright glow, but could not hear them like Dalos did. Humans were loud and a nuisance, but not a threat to the trees or Dalos. The shadowed trees did not care about men. They were a short-lived, annoying race, but were only like gnats to the trees. It was amusing to scare men when they came into Mirkwood, but that was where the shadowed trees' interest in them ended. Legolas was more curious and concerned. Could the man they spoke of be the assassin he searched for? That was unlikely, seeing as he seemed to be traveling with the elves. He looked upriver, then in the direction of the part of the river that was closest to him. He was less than a half-mile away, and could easily go to try to find the man. But what about his mission? He had to warn the Elven King about the assassin. The man's elven companions are searching for him, Legolas thought, but they still have to climb down the cliff face that swoops down after the ravine ends. That will take them a while. I'm closer and know this forest. I can find the man faster. If he's injured, he will need help." "Where is the man now?" the assassin asked the trees, voice neutral and betraying none of the urgency he felt. Downriver," they said in that same uncaring tone. "We can see him next to the water." "Lead me there," Legolas told them. The trees' unpredictable moods shifted once more, interest and enthusiasm entering their thoughts. Legolas was interested in the man. They did not understand why, but they would show him the mortal. Following the tree's directions, the elf slowly became aware of the man's presence. It was strong, but his energy was sluggish, so he was most likely unconscious or injured then. The assassin was soon at the river. The location he had been led to was shortly after the ravine ended, where the land was barely above the waterline. Legolas spotted the man immediately, lying limp at the rushing water's edge. He had dark hair and wore the garb of a ranger. The man was laying on his side, facing away from the river, his clothes soaked and dripping water. A small trickle of blood was running down the side of his head. The elf could see him breathing, his chest rising and falling steadily. He could not have swallowed much water then. Legolas ran up to the unconscious human, kneeling down and listening to his chest. His lungs were clear, confirming his first assessment. The assassin carefully felt around the small wound on the man's head, feeling no large contusions or unnatural bumps and edges that would suggest a broken skull. It was unlikely he had a serious head injury, and a quick scan of the rest of the man told Legolas he had no other broken bones or large wounds. The elf shook his head in amazement. "You are either the luckiest human out there, because you fell into a ravine and only got a bump on the head, or you are the unluckiest man alive, because you fell into a ravine at all." He lifted the man, carrying him away from the water's edge and into the trees. The assassin set him down, leaning him against a tree and ripping off a part of his cloak, dabbing at the small cut on the man's temple. The bleeding had stopped, but the human would have an ugly bruise and a bump soon enough. "Now what?" Legolas questioned himself. "I have no idea of when the assassin is going to strike, only that he is already in Mirkwood. I need to warn the elves, but I can't just leave this man here alone." The man shifted, moaning. Legolas leapt away from him, resisting the urge to reach for his weapons. He watched warily as silver eyes, familiar eyes, fluttered open, a puzzled expression crossing the man's features. He looked around in confusion, eyes quickly landing on the elf. Instantly, the man was on his feet, hand groping for a weapon that was no longer at his hip. Abandoning his useless search, the man settled into a defensive stance, ready to dodge or attack if necessary. He kept a careful eye on the cloaked and hooded figure in front of him. Legolas did not move, keeping his posture non-threatening and calm. "Relax," he said. "I am a friend." Slowly, the elf reached up and lowered his hood and facial mask, revealing his hair, eyes, and other features. The man paused, peering at him, but only blinked once in surprise as his silver eyes met Legolas's violet. He did not speak, keeping his silence. Elf and man stared at each other mutely for a time. "Well, this is the first time I am the one that has to instigate a conversation," Legolas thought. "You are a very lucky man," he said to the human. "Not many of your race would be able to fall into a ravine and escape from the encounter with only a bump and a few cuts to show for it. Do you hurt anywhere?" "Nothing serious," the man replied slowly. "I only have a headache and a few small aches. Other than that, I'm fine." His silver eyes scanned the trees, then looked up at the sun like he was trying to judge his location. I'm downriver? Yes, Legolas said simply. I do not know where you fell in, but you can see the end of the ravine over there. The elf pointed at the distant cliff-like structure. You have never been to Mirkwood before, have you? He asked intuitively, noting the man's still lost expression. No, I have not, he admitted reluctantly. I was traveling to the Elven King's palace with my father and brothers. The elf's head tipped, and he studied the man acutely. All of your companions were elves, he stated. The man paused, most likely wondering how he knew that, then nodded. Yes. His features, surprisingly easy for Legolas to read, shifted rapidly from wariness to conflict to pondering before settling into a decided expression. My name is Estelle, and I am the adopted son of Lord Elrond of Imladris. The adopted son of Lord Elrond? Could he be? Legolas discreetly studied the man next to him, taking in the familiar dark hair, jawline, and bright silver eyes. Now he knew why the man's eyes were familiar. A smile flashed across the assassin's face. It is. How quickly the years have passed. The last time I saw you, you were only a babe, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Estelle, Aragorn, was watching him, waiting for the elf to introduce himself. The elf took a moment to take in the man that the babe he had carried to Rivendell had become. The eye color and hair was the same, but the baby that had chewed on his hair was completely gone, replaced by a ranger and a warrior, and maybe, one day, a king. Legolas did not see the babe he had taken to Imladris, or the child that Elrond, the twins, and many other elves sometimes saw when looking at their brother, son, or friend. He only saw a warrior and a grown man, with a fire in his eyes and determination in his brow. A man that for some reason he felt an instant connection with. It is a pleasure to meet you, Estelle, Legolas said with a small grin. My name is Esgol. Man and elf stood on the river bank, almost unaware of the world around them. They were focused on each other, halfway in and out of the mindset that the other might be a threat. Both were wary, but cautiously reaching out and trusting each other in the smallest way. Soon, that small crack in the gate that held their trust would burst open, and a friendship would be formed that few could compare to, even among the race of elves. But for now, the two guarded themselves, even as the far less trusting elf granted the human a smile. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance as well, Esgol, Aragorn said, glancing down at his empty scabbard. If you had your sword when you fell into the river, it is gone, the violet-eyed elf informed him. The ranger shook his head, wringing out a bit of his cloak. I lost it before I fell into the ravine. During your fight with the spiders, then, Esgol stated. Aragorn glanced at him, eyes narrowed. How do you know about that? And how do you know I was traveling only with elves? The glowless elf's eyes closed and his head tipped, as if he were listening to something the man could not hear. Normally, spiders only attack loners or those who wander into their nests, depending on the number of them compared to the number of elves they are facing. The ones that attacked you must have been desperate, he murmured almost to himself. The ranger glared at him. You did not answer my questions. In fact, you just completely ignored them. Violet eyes opened and met his silver orbs. The trees told me of your battle and companions, Estelle. They have just informed me that your adoptive father, Glorfindel, Aristor, and that moody warrior are headed to the palace to ask the Elven King to send out a search party, while your brothers and the other warriors continue to look for you. That made Aragorn pause. The trees told you? He looked around at the dark, angry-looking shadowed trees around them. But elves can only talk to light trees. A vaguely uncomfortable look crossed Esgul's face before he slipped back into a blank mask. "I can speak with the shadowed trees," he said shortly. "They assist me as well." The man stared at him, all of the facts his father had told him about elves and shadowed trees running through his head. "Really? You can understand them? And they listen to you?" "Yes," the elf said after a pause. "I know their language, and they do not hate me because I have no glow, unlike other elves." "Amazing," Aragorn breathed. "I have never heard of an elf that—" He paused, mouth moving silently, before his eyes widened with realization. "You're the hidden guardian, aren't you?" Esgul looked taken aback. "What?" "The hidden guardian. The person that protects the forest and killed all those orcs and spiders," the man explained. A perplexed expression crossed the elf's face. "I've never heard someone call me that before." The man blushed at his words. "Glorfindel used to tell me stories about the warrior that protected Middle-earth from the shadow when I was younger. He never named you, just calling you the warrior, so I decided to call you the hidden guardian." "Glorfindel told you stories about me?" Esgul sounded flabbergasted. "I had no idea." The man gave him a sharp look, piecing together bits of the puzzle. "You know each other," Aragorn stated slowly. Esgul gave him a neutral look. "Do we?" he asked. "Yes," the ranger said firmly. "I can tell by both your words and tone." The two stared intently at each other, Legolas debating whether he should deny it, and Aragorn knowing he was right. "Fine. You're right. We do know each other," the elf admitted after a pause. "He is a close friend of mine." A frown crossed his face, and his eyes darkened. "Speaking of friends, I'm afraid that I have to cut this conversation short. I need to get to the palace." "That was where I was traveling to," Aragorn said, stepping forward to stand in front of him. The news that the mysterious elf was the hidden guardian and Glorfindel's friend had caused the remainder of the man's wariness to expire. "Why are you headed there?" "The Witch King has sent an assassin to kill the Elven King," the elf said bluntly. "I must warn the elves and stop the assassin before he can kill his target." Aragorn's entire person changed from slightly awed to determined and grim. "We had better get moving then," he stated. He prepared himself for the elf to say no, that the man would only slow him down and get in the way. His brothers were out searching for him. He should stay here, the forest was dangerous, etc. It came as a surprise when Esgul only nodded, turning towards the forest. "Follow me." The elf ran into the forest, and the man, after a startled pause, went after him. Aragorn was slightly faster than most humans, but Esgul was still forced to move at a slower pace than his usual, particularly since he could not go bounding through the trees to reach his destination. They moved quickly through the forest, the elf leaving no trace, and the man leaving only a small trail to follow. He was used to having to run through the woods. "I am surprised that you are willing to pass on this message to the elves, and thus reveal yourself to them," Aragorn said. "I may not know much about the Mirkwood elves and royal family, but I am sure they do not know about you. Of you, perhaps, but not know you." "That assumption is correct," the elf said, "but my preference to remain an anonymous guardian does not matter as much as the warning I must give." The ranger nodded in agreement. "Do you know why the Witch King has decided to kill Thranduil now? And how do you know about the assassin at all?" "I followed a vague tip-off, and it turned out to be a large plan made by the enemy," the elf told him. "Apparently, the Witch King thinks his forces will be able to return in force to Mirkwood if the Elven King dies." "That is a very real assumption," Aragorn murmured darkly. "If Thranduil dies, the woodland realm will be in chaos. the people will lose their will to fight. Exactly, Nazgûl said, and his violet eyes flashed in anger. That is the way of the shadow. Not slowing, he leapt over a large root, the ranger following suit. Nazgûl, Aragorn murmured suddenly, studying the elf beside him. Hidden. That is a name that suits you well, but still, what an interesting name it is. The pale, blonde-haired elf's eyebrow quirked upward as he looked at the man. If you say so, Hope. The man groaned, shaking his head. Don't say it in Westron, please. It sounds like a girl's name. It is a girl's name, Nazgûl said innocently. Shut up, elfling, the ranger snapped irritably. Excuse me? The elf asked quietly, violet eyes narrowing as his mood shifted from cheerful to dark. His dangerous expression made the man quickly backtrack. I didn't say anything. Nazgûl smirked. That's what I thought. They continued on through the forest in companionable silence, focusing on reaching their goal. The uneven ground was passed over easily by both, the man showing great agility and sure-footedness for his kind. Being raised by elves really had its benefits. The elf continued their conversation abruptly, almost making the ranger trip as the silence between them was broken. I call myself Nazgûl, not only because I wish to hide from my enemies, but because my past is hidden from me. I do not remember my birth parents, or where I come from. I do not even remember my mother's hair color anymore. I was raised by a Dunedain named Siren from when I was 5 years old. He was killed by orcs many years ago. I'm sorry, Aragorn murmured. A flicker of pain crossed Nazgûl's face before vanishing. It is all right. The past is the past. Ever since my adopted father's death, I have made it my mission to fight against the shadow. Mostly, I assist by slaying orc patrols and rescuing people, it seems. From what I hear, you have a great part in keeping this forest from falling into darkness, the man mused. It is amazing that one elf can do so much. I have help, the elf said modestly. The shadow trees assist me. Aragorn did not respond. His eyes were on the ground, a frown marring his features. Look at this, he said suddenly, kneeling on the ground and brushing aside some leaves. Nazgûl knelt beside him, fist clenching at his side as he spotted what the man had seen. That is a boot print. No elf would leave a mark like that. A man has been through here, the ranger murmured, walking along slowly as he followed the barely noticeable trail. He tried to hide his tracks, but he failed, slipping up in small ways anyone who was not a tracker would not notice. No man would come through here, not alone, Nazgûl stated with surety, unless... His violet eyes widened, and he grinned slyly at the ranger. You do have quite the luck, Estelle. Maybe, but once again, my luck could be good or bad, depending on what happens next, Aragorn said softly, eyes on the broken twigs he spotted. I do believe that we have found the assassin's trail. But will we be able to stop him? Or will he stop us? The man thought.